These are the lecture notes for Chapter 11, the cardiovascular system, the part on the blood. So before I get started with the cardiovascular system, I just want to introduce it by saying that we are going to cover the cardiovascular system in 3 chapters. I will do my best to simplify and make the chapters as brief as I can, cut out some of the material so that it's not so overwhelming. But the major components are going to be the blood, then chapter 12 is the heart, and chapter 13 are the blood vessels. So as I get to each chapter, I'll tell you which parts to focus on. With chapter 11 on the blood, you really just need to know the main components of the blood and the red blood cells, and there are 5 different white blood cells, and the plasma, the blood plasma. Just understand the components of the blood plasma, understand the cells that form, in the blood, the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets, and be able to identify them and briefly describe them. We're not going to go into I am going to teach you about blood typing, but I don't ask a lot of questions in the activities in mastering. So anyway, let's get started with the chapter on the blood, chapter 11. And we're going to introduce the cardiovascular system. It functions as the body's internal transport network. It includes the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels, which is why we have 3 different chapters. It is the first organ system to become fully operational during the embryo, during the embryo's life. And as far as transport, the substances that are transported by the blood are nutrients like, your simple carbohydrates and your fats and your proteins, your amino acids, fatty acids, oxygen, waste products such as carbon dioxide, urea, uric acid, and chemical messengers like hormones. So the blood transports a lot of different chemicals. The functions of blood are to transport dissolved gases, nutrients, hormones, and waste, to regulate the fluid pH and ion composition of the blood plasma, and then that ends up affecting the interstitial fluid, or what we call tissue fluid. The blood restricts fluid loss at injury sites. We call this blood clotting. The white blood cells defend against toxins and pathogens, and then the blood, it stabilizes body temperature by the dilation and constriction of blood vessels primarily. All right, so the composition of blood, whole blood consists of plasma and formed elements. The plasma portion of the blood is the liquid matrix, because blood is a connective tissue, so it has a matrix. And the ground substance is a liquid or a fluid. And the plasma makes up about 55% of blood volume in a healthy person. Formed elements are the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. And platelets are just fragments of cells. They're cell fragments. Formed elements make up about 45% of the volume of blood in a healthy person. Now, there is a difference in males and females, and the difference is primarily because males tend to have a larger body size than females. That's the only difference. The only reason for the difference is the difference in body size. So males tend to have between 5 to 6 liters of blood, and females tend to have 4 to 5 liters. So about 1 liter less than males on average for females. For characteristics of blood, blood is thicker than water. So the way we would say that in science is blood is 5 times more viscous or more concentrated than water. And what leads to this viscosity is that there are plasma proteins that are dissolved in the blood plasma that make the plasma thicker than water or more viscous. And also the cells, the formed elements, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, all of those help to increase the concentration of blood compared to water and compared to your tissue fluid, your interstitial fluid. The pH of blood is slightly alkaline or basic. A healthy pH for blood is between 7.35 and 7.45. It's dangerous when the pH of blood goes too high or too low. That leads to acidosis or alkalosis, which are both dangerous conditions. For blood collection and analysis, some of our medical terms, venipuncture is the term for when we collect blood from veins. We usually do that when we need to do analysis on, a larger volume of blood, when we need to do a blood panel. And we collect that blood from the median cubital vein. So make sure when we are going to go over in chapter 13, we're going to go through the arteries and the veins of the body, and that's one you will definitely need to know the name and location and function of it. That is the vein where we take, when you get blood drawn from the bend in your elbow, that when you get blood drawn through venipuncture, they use the median cubital vein for, with some exceptions, but this is primarily the vein that is used. We use veins for collecting whole blood because the blood pressure is lower, of course. We try to collect blood from an artery, and sometimes we need to do that because we need to measure blood oxygen levels and blood carbon dioxide levels. But it's dangerous because the pressure in arteries is so great, you don't want your patient to bleed out. You can collect blood from capillaries, and we do that usually by pricking the fingertips or the earlobe in children. And usually that's used for something like if you're a diabetic, that can be used to check for blood glucose levels because you don't need, this is for small samples. It's also used to make blood smears on microscope slides so that you can view the actual blood cells under a microscope. The question here in the checkpoint is, why is venipuncture a common technique for obtaining a blood sample? It's because veins are under lower pressure than arteries. The plasma portion of blood contains 92% water, 7% plasma proteins, and these are not in connective tissue. We always talk about the fibers like collagen and elastin and reticular fibers. Blood doesn't have those protein fibers, but it does have proteins like albumin, hemoglobin, immunoglobulins or antibodies. You may call them antibodies. So there's different plasma proteins we'll talk about in the next slide that are mostly produced by the liver. Then the plasma also contains other solutes, such as hormones, nutrients, and gases, and ions. The three major types of plasma proteins are albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. The albumins are, their function is mostly to keep the concentration of the blood high, so that the blood is thicker than the tissue fluid, or it's more concentrated than the tissue fluid. So it has pressure, osmotic pressure, that is pulling water into the blood vessels. So it's constantly, osmosis is constantly driving water to move into the blood vessels, and that way we don't have a lot of tissue swelling, So globulins include transport proteins like hemoglobin. Hemoglobin transports oxygen and carbon dioxide. And antibodies, which are also called immunoglobulins, are considered are types of globulins. And those are, of course, they function in the immune system. And then globular proteins or globulins that transport lipids are called lipoproteins. Fibrinogen is the plasma protein that functions in blood clotting. Now, you probably have heard of blood plasma and also blood serum. So there's a slight difference. If you take out the clotting proteins, then the plasma will be called serum. And then more than 90% of plasma proteins are synthesized in the liver. As far as the solutes dissolved in plasma, we have nutrients like lipids, carbohydrates, amino acids from proteins, and vitamins that are dissolved in plasma. Electrolytes, the important ones are sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride, hydrogen phosphate, bicarbonate, and sulfate. So these are electrolytes that are really important for different functions, different physiological functions of the body. Then we have waste like urea, uric acid, creatinine, bilirubin, and ammonium ions. So these are going to be transported to sites where they can be excreted from the body. Now, what would be the effects of a decrease in plasma proteins? Well, it kind of depends on which plasma proteins. If all of them decrease, then we have a longer answer. But if the level of albumins decreases, if the level of plasma proteins decreases in general, you're going to have a less concentrated blood plasma. So you won't have as much pressure drawing water into the blood vessels. That may lead to swelling in the tissues. That's one of the effects. But also, if you have a decrease in, say, hemoglobin, then you're going to have anemia. You're going to have areas of the body that don't get enough oxygen. If you have a decrease in antibodies, then that can be a lowered immune system. So decrease in clotting proteins, and then you're going to have blood that doesn't clot like it should. So lots of different effects, but probably I would say the primary effect is going to be, in general, it's going to cause the blood to be less concentrated, which means that it's not going to have the osmotic pressure to draw as much water from the tissues into the blood vessels. So you may have swelling in the tissues. Now, the formed elements of the blood, by far the most numerous are the red blood cells, and those are called erythrocyte. Erythro means red, cyte means cell. So the red blood cells account for 99.9% of the formed elements. There are way more red blood cells than there are white blood cells or platelets. Red blood cells contain a red pigment molecule called hemoglobin, which is the reason why the blood has the red color, the deep red color. Hemoglobin is used, it's a globulin, one of the plasma proteins, and it's used to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide, although mainly its primary use is transporting oxygen. So how we determine the abundance of red blood cells, we can do a red blood cell count. Men typically have 5.4 million red blood cells on average. Women have 4.8 million red blood cells on average. That's partially hormonal because men have more testosterone than women. We can also do a hematocrit. That's very common. The hematocrit is the percentage of whole blood occupied by red blood cells. So in men, that is 46%, and in women, it's 42%. The hematocrit in men is larger than it is in women. As far as the structure of red blood cells, they're biconcave. That means they're flat, they're circular shaped, but the top and bottom surface of the cell is concave. So it's almost like a donut started to form, but the hole didn't form all the way. Now we're not going to focus on the information about red blood cell formation, except just to know what it's called. We're not going through all the steps of how a red blood cell forms, all the names of the different immature red blood cells. You just need to know red blood cells form in the bone marrow, in the red bone marrow, and that they're called erythrocytes. So there's a lot of that information we're going to skip. But I do want you to know that red blood cells, when they are mature, they've lost most of their organelles. They have lost their nucleus. So mature red blood cells cannot divide and they can't produce proteins. This is what they look like. This is an electron micrograph image of a red blood cell, and this is what they look like under a light microscope. If we were to look at a blood smear, they have these little white circles in the center where their centers are kind of indented on the top and the bottom. So that's what that means biconcave. Now we have the hemoglobin molecule that is found in the red blood cell. You just need to know that it transports oxygen and carbon dioxide. The oxygen binds to the portion of the hemoglobin called the heme subunit, and it actually binds to iron within the heme subunit. And then carbon dioxide binds to the globin subunits of the hemoglobin. Most oxygen is transported by hemoglobin, but some carbon dioxide is attached to hemoglobin, but other carbon dioxide is transported, like dissolved as bicarbonate ions in the blood. So hemoglobin primarily serves to transport oxygen. Okay, you probably heard of the condition called anemia. That is a reduction in the blood's oxygen carrying capacity. It can be caused by low hematocrit or reduced hemoglobin content in the red blood cells. Symptoms of anemia include muscle fatigue and weakness and general lack of energy.